Welcome to the Chapter 56 podcast. So in this podcast, we're going to talk about just some of the ways in which we can try to minimize and in some cases even fix the damage and the impact that humans have on the environment. And so you can see here from the picture that you've got situations where through mining, through lumber, for a variety of reasons, you can strip the land of trees, vegetation, and thereby the animals. And so we're going to discuss kind of how humans have in general negatively impacted the environment around them. So first of all, let's discuss this idea that some people say we have this sixth mass extinction or this biodiversity crisis going on right now. Whereas over time, there's been kind of a steady extinction rate that's gone on, but you have certain periods where you see spikes that we'll consider mass extinctions. And so right now, the issue is that the rate of extinction is incredibly high. Overall, there will always be some extinctions, and that's fine. But when you start to have 10 or 100 or 1,000 times the normal rate of extinction, you start to wonder if something bad is going on. So one of the reasons we're likely getting to this point where there's a lot more extinctions is because the amount of habitat change, or as we'll say, loss or destruction that we have. As humans put up housing and roads and farms, we've gone through and destroyed huge chunks of land for nature's purposes, or at least as the way it was being used. Obviously, other animals can perhaps live in a wheat field, but the animals that lived in the forest cannot. And so when you destroy 90% of any particular habitat, you have about 50% of the species that no longer can live there. And so if that's the only place they live, what we call an endemic species, then those guys could feasibly go extinct. And so that's the number one thing that threatens species right now is habitat destruction. Now, next, you've got competition by exotic or invasive species, where your Burmese python gets out with several others, they start reproducing, and so the Everglades now has tons of these that are devastating the native wildlife. Because oftentimes these introduced species can outcompete native species. In many cases, they don't have a natural predator that's there to control their population size. And so there's a variety of reasons why these can do a lot of damage, even in a small amount of time, especially on islands. And so exotic species or invasive species are one chunk of it that has a major effect. And then lastly, you have the one that's the most direct. Destruction of the habitat, competition, these are more like indirectly killing something. Overexploitation is just where, no, we killed them. You're seeing this with lots of fish species where we're overfishing. You're seeing this with many species that we like for their fur, things like that where we hunt them near to or to extinction. The rhinoceros right now is going through this as people still want the rhino horn because they believe somehow it has medicinal benefits because they don't understand science. And so they kill these rhinoceri, if that's the plural, us's, to get to that horn, which is really pretty much like skin or fingernail, because that's going to somehow cure their cancer or something. It doesn't work out, but it does kill off those organisms, and it can lead to extinction. So why do humans care about biodiversity? The first one is there's lots of organisms, lots of plants especially out there that produce substances that we have used for medical purposes. And so over here you have a willow tree. Willow is used because it produces the substance, salicylic acid I believe is what it is. I could be off. But basically aspirin. Did I just spell aspirin with a U? Wow. It's break, people. So we have aspirin that it produces, which we then have now made in more of a laboratory or commercial setting, but we discovered this substance from the bark of trees, from certain plants that contain this. And so there's lots of other medications that we have derived, that we have found in living organisms, which we can then always mass produce and make in a laboratory. But we still found it, we still discovered it because it was in some type of living organism. If we kill off living organisms and whole species, we no longer have access to those substances that they've produced. You also no longer have access to their genes because as we get to an era of more biotechnology and genetic engineering, every species has potential alleles or genes that we could use to add to other organisms to make them better able to live and cope. So it could be better insect resistance that I can give to corn or wheat. It could be better disease resistant that you could give to cattle or something like that. But these genes that they possess are a commodity that could be useful later scientifically. And then there's aesthetics. They're pretty. And then there's ethics. Do we really have the right as humans, especially if we could avoid it, to go through and cause the extinction of many different species? And there's certainly some argument that could be made there as you kind of decide between economics and just kind of, the cost of trying to preserve everything. But for many of these species, you don't have to do a whole lot to not make them go extinct. And so can you really justify not doing at least something to try to keep them from going extinct? Is that okay as a species to just be like, yeah, screw a bunch of these other guys? Now, with conservation, there's several different ideas about how we do this. Preservation is you keep things that are essentially undisturbed. And so this is trying to keep these undeveloped, undisturbed lands and to keep them as they are, to prevent them from being exploited. For resource conservation, this is more like trying to develop a system that uses a lot of areas for multiple uses. So we go through and we might be doing mining as well as other resource extraction all in one area, so we don't spoil more than we have to. This allows us to preserve the rest. We can also focus on conserving resources by watching how much of the resource we use. You could try things like recycling to prevent us from having to go and use more resource. So this is more about using what we need and what we have more wisely. And then the evolutionary ecological view is this idea that all these species that are out there, all this biodiversity has functions. And if we mess with the ecosystem, that ecosystem tends to do certain biological functions for us. It could be filtering our water, it could be providing us with oxygen, it could be providing animals that we're using with food if you're grazing the animals. So we have to be careful that we don't allow one organism to suffer, and then that species that we just harmed affects another species, which affects another, and so we get this collateral damage, and suddenly something that was serving us a valuable function is no longer there to do that. And so now we have to deal with those consequences. So this one's more of a broad and interdependent view of looking at how things connect and how it can impact us. And this is a guy putting headphones onto a bear. At least it looks like. It's actually a collar that has the radio controller here so they can track it. So this would just be one of those ways that we try to understand for this evolutionary ecological view, as well as for resource conservation even ideas. We're trying to understand, how best we can use our resources, how best to use the land to not harm species, especially some of the bigger species that have more needs. They have to roam more area to get food. They have to eat more food. Geographic distribution of biodiversity. This is not equal. If you look up here at Canada, Canada does not have a lot of species diversity because it tends to be so cold so much of the time. And when it's cold so much of the time, you don't have a whole lot of energy available for capture. Typically, that's going to be sunlight. And so that means that there's not a whole lot of autotrophs at the base of that food web or food chain. And so that means as you move up the energy pyramid, you just get fewer and fewer individuals, less and less energy. And so you tend to see a food web or food chain that has many fewer steps. Maybe there's like 3 guys. I eat the grass, this guy eats me, we're done. Whereas when you go further south, you start to get where it's tropical year-round. So if you've got plenty of water, you've got lots of sunlight that's available. So there's a lot more energy that's going into the autotrophs, which means more food for the heterotrophs, which means more guys can eat those heterotrophs, and on and on. So you're going to end up getting also where there's habitat heterogeneity. And this just means that you can get itself within things where there can be this patchiness based upon mountains, based upon specific wind patterns and ocean patterns like we talked about before in Chapter 52, where it's not like everything's always identical. It's not like just because you're at one set latitude that everything will be the same no matter what. And so based upon the geography around you, based upon the weather conditions, the climatic conditions, specifically what's going as far as currents is usually the big deal, ocean or air. And so based upon those, you can also get where things get to be patchy, because there's a dry spot here, there's a wetter spot here, there's a warmer spot. Then you get niche specialization. Typically, more stable and more energetic environments tend to have where there's more niches, these small kind of slots, if you will, in the environment that can be sustained. So I like to think of this where if you go to New York, you're going to see a lot more boutiques, a lot more small specialized shops, because there's so many more people there that those shops can still get by. So if you have an ecosystem that has plenty of energy available, you can tend to develop lots of these small niches where things start to specialize. And so you'll see many of these specialists where, I eat a specific type of ant, or the panda where it's like, I just eat bamboo. And so when you see a lot more of these specialists, because the environment's diverse enough to handle that, you get a lot more biodiversity. Surprise, surprise. And then population interactions, just who else is there, the living type situations. We've talked about this with guinea pigs, where they tend to live the places that they do largely because of a lack of predators. So they live in like mountains and things like that because they can avoid their predators. Otherwise, they tend to get eaten and they'd go extinct in that area because they just don't do well when they're trying to cope with other organisms. They don't cope well when they're dealing with other biotic stuff. So population interactions will also be a key. So species conservation, this is how we try and keep things as they are or improve them. And so with species conservation, you can see that we've got a fair amount of damage. So we've got more and more endangered species. This is going up. And funding is going up to some extent, but not quite as much. So we have to be smart about how we use our resources. So with this, when we're trying to evaluate kind of what to do with these species, we'll focus on endemic species, which means they only really live in one area. So they might just live on this island or just in this one part of the rainforest. So they're one of the most susceptible to going extinct. We obviously tend to focus on endangered species, which are very close to going extinct, or threatened species, which are very close to becoming endangered. So you've kind of got this scale here, threatened to endangered to good old extinct. And just in case you see this word, if you see the word extant, that means still alive. So if you see that, that's not like that bad a thing. That's typically a fairly good thing, I suppose, in the sense that they're still around. And then bioremediation is just a simple word, if you will. It might look intimidating, but this is just the idea, too, that we can focus on using living organisms in some cases to try and get rid of some of the damage that we've done. So bioremediation is trying to use something like bacteria to go in and break down toxins that could be present somewhere. You could try to get bacteria that could break down things like oils, so you could put them in the water to have them clear up some of the messes that we made. But instead of using a bunch of other harsh chemicals that could have a bunch of other side effects, we're trying to do so by using living organisms that hopefully would not do as much damage in the process of cleaning stuff up. We're trying to make things as minimally invasive or obstructive as possible. And so this is kind of a newer field. I'm not going to say it's brand new, but it's getting more attention now as we try and fix the damage that we've done. And this can be a cost-effective and hopefully less harmful way of going in and trying to get some of these areas that we've really messed up to try to get them more back to normal. So that's more on the restoration side. I hope this helped you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it and are having a good break. Take it easy.